All right, are there any questions before we get to the examples? Again, I can't see everyone while I'm sharing, so if you have a question, just unmute yourself and say it. So here are some examples of primary, principal, and distributed faulting. So in these, the red is the principal fault, and the blue and yellow are the distributed faults or deformation. And so in this first case on the left, we see this red fault. So it's the principal fault, and it fits fairly well with what we think of, at least initially, as the principal fault, where it's a fairly straight and continuous fault trace. And then here there are some secondary faults, which are colored in blue and yellow. The numbers here are the amounts of slip for this particular earthquake, and the color of the dot corresponding to if the slip measurement was on a principal or a distributed fault. But the principal fault can also take on more complex expressions at the surface. So in this case, we have this en echelon fault, which is stepping to the left, and then we see these, all these little en echelon steps of the fault. And in this case, the authors still labeled the full fault as primary because it represents, or these en echelon segments all represent rupture from the primary fault at depth. And we just get this more complicated expression in the very upper portion of the crust. And this case in the middle is fairly similar, where we see this branching. So again, we have this fairly complicated branching set of ruptures at the surface, but these authors determined that they likely all represent slip from the primary fault at depth. And then in this fourth example, which I think is very interesting, this is an example of trifurcated branching, where the red or principal fault here splits into these three segments, and then they combine or into one segment here just to the north. You have a question, Ob?
Yeah, so you call that trifurcated, but like, is it usually breaking into three parts, or there are other options where you have like 4 branches or 5 or 2?
Yeah, so you can have different number of branches, but in this example, they found 3. And in the color or in the numbers, that's the amount of slip in meters. So for each of these segments, it was about 1/3 of a meter. And so that's because the fault slip was similar. That's why each of these 3 segments were labeled as the principal faults. And then if you go to the east, it looks like they mapped 2 other branches that had much, much less slip. And so they were called the distributed fault. And these are ruptures. So longer term, looking at the pre-rupture mapping, we're not going to be able to measure the slip in the same way that they've done here. But you might think if these 3 segments each had a similar representation in the geomorphology, maybe a similar number of or quality of geomorphic indicators, then we may call them all primary faults. And we might expect that the distributed ruptures create a smaller signal in the geomorphology. And so they would be secondary or distributed slip. For what it's worth, exactly how to assign probability and the hazard to these three faults in the case of branching like this receives a lot of attention in the PUFTA work. So it's interesting, it's challenging, and it's actually quite important which one you think is going to rupture, or if they're all going to rupture with equal probability. Are there any questions? So yeah, and then this last example is the anastomizing fault, where we see these curvilinear intersecting and fairly short segments, but they were all labeled as the principal fault because, again, the mapper interpreted that they all represent the rupture of the same principal fault at a fairly shallow depth within the crust. Are there any questions? Comments? Okay, and so this group came up with this scheme that can be used to determine if the fault is the principal fault or if it represents distributed deformation. And I'd like to emphasize that exactly how you apply an approach like this, or perhaps a different one that you've developed for your mapping, does depend on the local properties of the fault, the geomorphology, and the data set that you have, as well as your interpretations as the geologist. But it's always important that you can justify your reasoning. And so part of the report that you're writing for next week, one of the sections is to write a paragraph or so justifying how you've distinguished the principal from distributed faulting. And so I'll go over this example, which is done by this UCLA group, just as an example. It's not necessarily the one that you have to implement, but at least appreciate the logic to it and the fact that they expect the approach to be iterative. And so it's okay to change your mind about the primary or secondary fault, principal or distributed, as you're doing your mapping and you're seeing more and more of the fault.
How big should be the segment studied? Can like a part of a fault be principal and the other one be distributed?
Probably not. So yeah, if it's a primary fault, then there should be some continuity to it. So for example, if we have this fault here, even if it was not quite as straight, it would be weird probably to have the first half of it be primary and then the next part of it be secondary.
Okay, great.
So yeah, you do want a long strike connectivity, especially particularly of the primary fault. So just go over their approach. And again, you don't have to implement something exact like this, but I want you to understand, for us to discuss the logic that is behind this approach. And so they begin with, they call a basic criteria, and principal fault essentially is principal if it has a narrow zone or trace, it's long or continuous, or the faults seem to be spatially associated with each other. And so this case on the left would definitely fit into this first category. And the spatial association, once you thought about that for some time, then you may decide that, for example, these branching faults are all spatially associated with each other. And then they go to this advanced criteria. And so they're looking at like along strike connectivity. And so this is a little bit, I think, coming back to Obe's question, where principal fault should have a long strike connectivity. Then they have a criteria for distributed rankings. And so primary part of this is that the distributed ranking is not spatially associated with the principal fault, may not be a long strike. Of that, typically usually shorter, and they may not connect at depth to the principal fault. So these are the main definitions that they use, and then they have an iterative approach, which can be used to refine the approach for more complex geometries of faults. So the principal ranking here, it's still critical that the faults are spatially associated, even if there are some gaps in it. And then the second, the part here, they allow for some complexity in the distributed, or sorry, in the principal faulting. So these are most of the later examples that I discussed. So we can have en echelon splays that represent a shallow, a continuous rupture just below the surface. Can also have flower structures, localized push or pull apart features that again indicate complexity at the surface, but reflect a through-going fault, pretty shallow surface or pretty shallow subsurface within the crust. Can also include conjugate faults or different parallel traces or mole tracks that again relate to this single fault at depth. So in all of these, we're really thinking about what's happening to the fault beneath the surface where we cannot see it. And then they have some criteria for the distributed faulting. So this includes antithetic ruptures, hanging wall accommodation structures, minor synthetic fault traces that are parallel but not continuous to the main trace of the fault, cracking of the subsurface that fans out from the primary trace but doesn't actually reflect slip along the primary fault, which is related to ground fractures that reflect just the high shaking in from the energy release surrounding the fault. So again, yes, here is the criteria developed by the UCLA group for distinguishing the principal from distributed faulting. You're welcome to use something like this, or perhaps a simpler approach that you've developed. But again, in the report, we do want to see that paragraph or so where you justify your reasoning for how you distinguish between principal and distributed faulting. Are there any questions? Comments? So they made a document, just finding. So if you go to our webpage here, and then you go to fault mapping notes, then primary versus secondary faulting is the document from UCLA, which shows all those examples with brief discussion as well. So feel free to refer to that, both for their approach, but also to see how they formulate their text describing the approach that they've developed to distinguish those sets of faults. Are there any other questions? Comments?
I'll just add, thanks for that really clear presentation, Chelsea. And this is, I like this flow chart, and I also like the iterative concept. I think it's important for everyone to, realize first that there's, it seems subjective. And so how can we kind of diminish that subjectivity? And so one thing is to use some sort of structured approach like this. And then the second thing is to realize the iterative nature. You can't probably just do it once. You kind of have to cycle through your mapping and try to balance things out, and then you'll come up with something you're a little bit more comfortable with. But then finally, just write down what you thought, what your logic was. And if people do it slightly differently or very differently, as long as it's well explained, I think that's best.
Wait another few seconds for questions.
Rich said, let me just read this from Rich. It's good. The workflow chart gives you words to use that can help you describe how you determine primary versus secondary. Yeah, very good.
All right, Ramon, would you like to go with your lecture?
Yeah, I'm going to share let me just make sure I got the right screen. Does this look like a PowerPoint here? That says,
I think
yes?
Yes, now it does.
Okay. All right, let me see then. So the idea that we had was and I went through some of this the last time, but is just to look at lots of examples. That's how you learn. And so we called this heuristics by demonstration. So rules of thumb, examples of fault maps. And so let's see how other groups have solved these problems. And it's not exhaustive, but I did try to choose some things from some different environments. And hopefully you'll see something interesting, and please interrupt me as we go. But as we go, we want to look for what are the morphologic features that we see, where are some components that we might recognize for the GIR. Let's appreciate any superficial geologic mapping that's done. Let's think about this primary versus secondary issue that Chelsea has nicely just brought up for us. And then, the fundamental question, how well are the mapped features supported by the data? So this first one, this is where I ended last time, but it's these really nice maps from the Geological Survey of Japan. And this one is, sorry for the kind of poor presentation, it was just, it's a big map I put on the floor of my hallway here and just took a picture. But this is, the thing you can see is also the style of presentation, and we call it a strip map. And so the mapping is at 1 to 25,000, and just, along that fault zone, these strips of the mapping. And if we zoom in to, and I realize you probably can't see this that well, it's not that important, the explanation, but they differentiate some of the materials as well as the ages. That's what the colored polygons are. So kind of a superficial geologic mapping selectively applied, and then a lot of different fault types. So that's all these patterns of active fault, but also downthrown side of fault. That's what the ticks are showing, where you see some of the teeth and so forth. So, and here's just a zoom to one example, one place that was on a field trip I went to once, but you can see the fault trace is pretty simple. It does break here and there, but you see there's a lot of support for that trace from, this alluvial fan, which really has a fan pattern. They show some offset of some landforms, also, the edge of this terrace, but also some channels. So if you look at this little pond right here, that's shown here in this oblique view. So basically the fault's going right along this little mountain front, and you see, of course, the highways right on top of it, in a very urbanized and agriculturally dominated place here in Japan. So with that view, if you go back to the map, you can see that zone there, and the highways right there. And this is now, if we're same place, let's look at these kind of details around the reservoir. So this is a stereo pair, and this would be a good way to look at the mapping in a sort of traditional classical approach, would be to have 3D for your brain to visualize, but we do it a lot of times more virtually. But here you can see there's some, sorry, I'm just trying to get my mouse. Yeah, you can see a couple of little offset channels. Let me annotate in here. You see like this guy comes along here, and then another one here. Looks like some other features are kind of offset. So it's this ensemble of features that really help us to identify the fault zone. So let me just clear that, check the chat. So this is something that, the Japanese have sort of really have a lot of sense of urgency for this kind of mapping, given population density and the high seismic hazard, and had really pioneered a lot of this approach. So I'm just going to push on. The next one is thrust faulting. And this, I don't think I showed when we gave the thrust faulting lecture, but this is the Eastern Andean foreland thrust fault. So this is, you see the lower left there, you see the convergent margin on the west side of the Andes and South America, but on the east side, there's some accumulated deformation. And so this is a paper that I was part of a number of years ago, but in the upper right, you see these red dots, and the red dashed line are it's distance versus trench perpendicular velocity. So out here in the eastern part of the zone is some accumulated strain that might be released by slip along this huge thrust fault. So we started working on this, and there's more to do. But if you look first at these data, this is, you see the scale at the bottom. So 15 kilometers is that line, and this is SRT on shuttle radar topography mission 90-meter data. So this is coarse, but very high quality digital elevation models. And you can see with the hill shading and illumination from the left, from the west, especially on that left one, you can see this really impressive set of fault scarps that are breaking that Piedmont environment. And then on the right, you can see that there's a scarp that's more defined by a little bit more of a uplifted and degraded block. But you see also this transition, this kind of a left step with an overlap along that fault zone. And so this, and then also this Parapeti and Pilcomayo, these are big rivers that drain the Andes. And so one of our target areas was, for example, to look how the terraces in detail might have been offset by great earthquakes along this zone. And so then we took a flight, actually, once we flew in the plane along here. And so you can see, you know, this Chaco forest, it's called, and it's a place where you could really use LiDAR, but we still don't have it from there. But there's a break in this scrubby forest, and that view below shows the fault surface where it's overthrusting tertiary sandstone over these Holocene gravels. So we know there have been big earthquakes along this fault zone. But I was always amazed that we could see I was kind of shocked actually that the scarps were that clear in these particular digital elevation models. SRTM's radar, so it's not, you know, we're looking at some surface that's some average through the vegetation. It's not really the ground, but it gives us a pretty nice view of that reverse fault system. Any questions? Sorry, one more before I ask for questions. So here was then part of that flight. This was part of a proposal we put in that we never were successful. But you see in this location, this warping of the surface, that's where that thrust is. And it's probably, you know, we infer that probably it's kind of a monocline over a flattening thrust surface. And that's what's giving us that warp in these fields. And then another little scarp here below in this channel, basically this scarp and this terrace, and then a little bit higher scarp where this ridge comes toward us. So there's a kind of Himalayan style frontal thrusting, we think, but actually in the Eastern Andes. Any questions? Okay, let me push on. Wasatch Fault. So now normal fault. So this is something Rich talked about a lot, and you guys have some good experience, but this was something I found, which was kind of a nice little set of images from Emily Kleber, one of the alums from my group. So we're looking at the area just to the east of Salt Lake City. And this is if you ever go skiing at Snowbird, this is, you go kind of right by here. And there's actually a geologic park that's named for G.K. Gilbert because he was really moved by what he saw at this location. And so there's this Bell's Canyon is a famous displaced moraine that we'll see right where that pond is. So this is the imagery, you know, with color imagery. So you see mostly you see the suburbs, but there's actually a fault here. So let's flip through. So this next view is an older historic photo with less development. And so you may start to see some interesting features like a little scarp going through here. So obviously that pond, something is important there. And then the Utah Geological Survey has really been a pioneer of using airborne laser scanning. So this is the digital terrain model in a slope shade. So you see it's removed the vegetation and the buildings. And so now we can really see these fault traces. And so that pond is basically developed in a little graben along the fault zone that's cutting through a moraine. So the terminal moraines are right here, and then they're broken by the fault scarps. And so these are LGM moraines. They're, you know, 18,000, 15,000 years old. So it gives us a real sense of the activity of motion slippage along the Wasatch. So this is certainly something to worry about. One of the interesting things then is the kind of like what you guys are doing is comparing mapping. So the black, or sorry, the yellow lines are pre-LiDAR mapping. And so most of the traces were identified, but with the LiDAR, with the digital terrain models, additional traces were mapping, and what was there was sort of mapped more accurately. So this is a kind of a satisfying presentation, I thought, just quickly showing kind of the value of the digital terrain models, and also this interesting and very complex actually traces. And so here you might say, well, where's the primary trace? So, you know, I would say, so let's ask ourselves. So probably the primary trace is the one where the biggest scarp is, which is probably this one right here is the primary. But then, especially you see, let me just do blue. Like this one right here is actually oppositely dipping, so it's antithetic. So it sort of feels like for sure that must be a secondary, right? But some of these other traces in here are also dipping oppositely. So, you know, something like this might be a designation of primary and secondary. And I don't know, Chelsea, if you'd like to comment on this example. Sorry, go ahead and unmute.
One of the sets of maps is actually doing exactly, I think, this project.
Okay, crap.
It's okay though. It's not exactly in that area.
Okay,
but it's the
I
same
hid
map.
it.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys, I spaced out on exactly the assignment. So erase that from your mind if you're doing that one. But just maybe also show an example of primary versus secondary. I'm sorry, that's
Yes, and Rich has a good question, or a good point of note how good the air photo mapping was. And so when you're doing these projects, it's easy to be like, oh, the LiDAR is so much better than the air photo. But if you really stare at the air photo for a long time, you can see stuff that you know, isn't quite as obvious immediately. So do look for the value in those older data sets.
yeah, and probably they use stereo viewing of the historic aerial photography, so they were seeing more than just the flat 2D view.
Also, though, it's before all the development, and so you do get a different perspective of the landscape than today.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's erase that from our mind and go to something completely different, which is Fennoscandian postglacial faulting. So I wanted to find something different for you guys. And so this is actually something I've always thought that was super interesting. Is on the lower right, you can see this little cartoon. And basically what happens is that the weight of ice in northern latitudes during the last glacial maximum especially, but certainly before as well, was so strong that it deformed the crust and it changed the stresses in the crust. But once that ice melted, the recovery was sufficient to drive earthquake faulting. And, you know, this otherwise is a, you know, tectonically inactive zone if you think of, you know, Northern Europe. And so the upper left shows Sweden, Norway, Russia, Finland. So Finland is in gray in that diagram, but there's seismicity and there's actually some big fault scarps. And this was covered by ice. So we know these fault scarps are all younger than 18,000 years old. And a couple of other things on this slide to show. So the color is the geologic map. So these are breaking through Archean and Paleoproterozoic rocks. So they're ancient rocks that have mostly been scraped off by the activity of the ice. But then there's some quaternary superficial materials that are there, which helps us with the dating. And the other thing, just you may see this Jim McAlpin on the right there, the name. So this also comes from this postglacial seismicity and paleoseismology at Forsmark. This is a place actually in Sweden where there's a nuclear power plant and a proposed nuclear waste repository in Sweden in these rocks. And so there was a lot of concern actually with respect to PDFHA for possible rare ruptures through the repository. And the Forsmark, it's actually in sort of central Sweden at the lower left of this diagram, kind of down in here. And so the McAlpin work was kind of saying, well, and then it triggered some other review that maybe there's no clear evidence for post-glacial faulting that far south in Sweden, but it's an interesting question and has critical facility implications. So let me turn to the.
And is also relevant in Quebec.
Yeah, that's why I chose it actually, because I know you guys are probably sick of California. So I chose, yeah, and there's famous actually fault scarps in Canada of this type. But the Scandinavians have really been pioneering the application of LiDAR to their study, somewhat more than the Canadians maybe. Yeah, okay, Oben and Max are looking for PGFs in Quebec. Yes, excellent. Yeah, so let's look at some here, and maybe we'll look forward to you guys, your publications soon, right? Anyway, let's look here. So, oh yeah, so this one, just if you look, the zoom here in the geologic map says Suospalo and Retu. And if you look here, then this is the Google Maps satellite imagery. Can't see hardly anything, right? Looks like some agriculture, but these ponds, notice these couple of little lakes here, and also there's a little lake right here. So just keep your eye on those. And then now let's see the power of digital terrain models. Boom. So this is also with illumination from the northwest. And so this obviously a northwest facing scarp. And so it's super bright. So this is actually maybe not that difficult once you know what you're looking for to find these scarps. I think the challenge was in Scandinavia, everyone's like, nah, there's no way there's any faults. And so, and they didn't have this kind of data until the last decade. And so this was kind of revolutionary, was finding the scarps. And so here you can see, even though, so they're obviously pretty steeply dipping high angle structures, but there are some traces, some small secondary ones. It kind of breaks down, sometimes quite straight, sometimes a little bit more irregular and bends. And so they've done these blue and red lines are places where they did GPR, ground penetrating radar, and some trenching. You can see also the disruption of, there's one of the things about these environments is, of course, there's a lot of ice, but as the ice melts, there's a lot of lakes that are formed. And so this has these little shorelines that are formed in that zone that are broken by the ruptures. So then here is this one is, sorry, in Finnish Lapland. So this is northern Sweden or northern Finland. Then the next one is this one, which is in Sweden. And I just wanted to show it, these names, like Mikko is one of the big Swedish geological survey scientists who had led a lot of this work. And this just shows the hillshade on the actually, these are from two different places. So don't be confused. I was at first. The left side is for this place called Bolnas, and you can see it's showing the superficial geologic mapping. And so we see, let's just look at the, so the arrows are showing where the fault scarp is. This one's facing to the right, and the illumination comes from the upper left. And so bedrock is red, the till is blue, so glacial deposits. Glacial fluvial sediment is green, clay silt is light tan, and organic sediment is dark tan. So you see there's these, basically the blues showing kind of these drumlins and other features associated with the flow of the ice. And then in the low spots are some of the probably silts, maybe some lacustrine zones. But then this scarp is chopping through them. And what's important, like if you go to the Wasatch, you have the whole mountains there. But this is not showing cumulative slip like we see in the Wasatch. This is showing, just a couple of earthquakes at most in that period immediately after the ice melted and the crust responded. And then on the right is the different location, this Lilshogen scarp. And so you see the trace is cutting across these streamlined glacial landforms in this area. And then there's a, there's a dam right here. So again, critical facility with the fault trace next to it. And so any questions or comments, since we have our colleagues here from the high latitudes? You guys want to comment at all on this, Obe or Max, since you guys have even more experience than I do on this topic? We'll see if the story is the same in Quebec. Yeah, exactly. There's a new book that just came out on post-glacial faulting. Probably you guys saw that as a Cambridge University Press book. Okay, then push on. I know I don't have a lot more time. So one of the last things I wanted to show you guys was there's something, it makes me chuckle every time. Is something that one of the students who work with me originally, first PhD, Nathan Tokay, noticed. And we were working on these problems and we realized, you know what? The zoning for active fault zones actually has an unintended consequence in California. And what you can see, for example, this picture here, these are the yellow shows the Ocas Priolo setbacks. So those are regulatory defined zones where you're not supposed to build, or if you're there, you have to, sort of be aware of fault zones that has to be disclosed. And then the red would be fault traces. And what Nate started to realize, Nathan Tokay, was that it has had this unintended consequence. So I'll just read from the abstract. Despite hazard disclosures, social vulnerability is lowest within the AP regulatory zones, and vulnerability increases with distance from them. Because the AP Act requires building setbacks from active faults, newer developments in those zones are bisected by parks. Partial level analysis demonstrates that homes adjacent to these fault zone parks are the most valuable in those neighborhoods. So, at least in California and other places, you like to have a park near your house, or, see the coyotes running in your backyard, which is nice aesthetically, but it completely misses the hazard issue. So this was something I thought was super interesting, and something that, probably nobody really thought would actually happen. So anyway, that's that story. Any questions or comments on that?
It's also interesting because the AP laws really require that the faults are quite well mapped, probably better than our work shows they can consistently be done, at least with the data sets that we're using. And so those high property, high expensive faults may be in very hazardous areas, or high property hazards may be the most vulnerable.
Exactly. And so that shows us, we talk about critical facilities all the time, pipelines, dams, power plants, et cetera, but this distributed faulting through expensive real estate is another sort of economic implication. And then, the parks do preserve good paleoseismic sites. So you may have to dig up, hole 14 at the golf course, but at least doesn't have a house on it, maybe. So Rachel, you turn your video on. Did you have a comment?
No, nothing.
Yeah, Rich says they dug up Fairway 2 along the Hayward Fault. Yeah, so this has happened. So then just to finish, I had a few final thoughts. When you're looking at imagery, you want to remember, this is even before you get into the landforms, but just, interpreting, shapes of things, sizes, patterns, tone, texture, shadows, site, association, resolution, target. So just another kind of reminder of if you're lost, kind of how to build the story as you map. Thank you, Mindy. And then I'm since this is sort of the end of these overview lectures, I just want to come back to, you guys know, my favorite somewhat obscure diagram here of mapping, and to realize, these are, each place we map is a single place with a single set of geologic and geomorphic relationships. But how we map it depends on what the question is that we're asking. And so you were encouraging you guys to do this morpho mapping with superficial geologic mapping, and then accounting for maybe other processes operating over that surface, and in particular thinking about the geomorphic indicators, which are sort of somewhere in there between the morphologic and superficial geologic mapping as point indicators. So with that, I'll stop if anybody has an additional question or thing to add.
Thank you, Ramon. I think that does in fact conclude all of our lectures kind of about faulting background now. In the last a couple of minutes, I'll just recall that on Thursday, we'll have these breakout room discussions, and your homework is to prepare 3 slides showing an area where you're confident about mapping, where you have questions about your mapping, just something else that's interesting that you'd like to discuss with your classmates. Are there any questions? So a few minutes, be happy to end class early. And if anyone has questions about more specific about their project, happy to stay online for a few minutes.